Shalom and welcome back to Che Languages. For a long time I've promised about making this video and I'm finally doing it. The Indo-Iranian languages is a large branch of the Indo-European languages and it covers many languages, some of which have millions of speakers. There are three main subdivisions of the Indo-Iranian languages: the Iranian languages in the west, the Indo-Aryan languages mainly in India, and the Nuristani languages, which are a surprisingly small but completely distinct group. I'm not going to talk about them because there's not enough information about the Nuristani languages, but I know someone who did, so check out his video on it. Today we're going to be focusing only on Iranian languages, and we have three very interesting ones to talk about, so let's get on with the video. So the first language on our list today is spoken in quite a controversial region of the world, yet the language itself is obviously, well, a language, that being Ossetian. Here is the flag of both the Federal Republic of North Ossetia, which is a federal republic within Russia, and also the de facto yet partially recognised state of South Ossetia. And here's a map of where it is. South Ossetia is internationally recognised as a part of Georgia, as is Abkhazia. Russia sees them as independent states and is effectively trying to annex them, but that's a story for another time. So the Ossetian language itself is called Iran Evzeg. It's an Eastern Iranian language, and interestingly enough it's derived from Scythian. There was a migration across, which is why, despite being an Eastern Iranian language, it's one of the most westernmost spoken ones. There also used to be an extinct dialect spoken in what's now modern day Hungary, which is really interesting. We had Iranian languages in Hungary. It has almost 600,000 speakers according to a 2010 survey. About 10% of them live in South Ossetia, the rest of them live in the Russian Republic of North Ossetia. And it's official in both states. But now let's look at the phonology. As you can see, the letter ash represents a rather rare phoneme. It's somewhere between an a and an e. Sounds a bit like air. And as for the consonants, they make a distinction between emphatic and non-emphatic consonants such as p, t, ts, ch, k. I think this could be an influence from the Georgian language, given that it's a characteristic feature of Georgian, and Georgian does it a lot, and it's not really very common in other languages, especially not Iranian languages, but I can't really say for certain. As you can see, Ossetian is written in the Cyrillic script. It wasn't always this way. The first text we have was from the 10th to 11th century, and it was written by a Greek scribe who wants to transcribe the local language. This is what it transliterates to, and it means roughly this. We don't know who these people were or anything, but this is as good as a translation we can get. However, in the 1920s, when the USSR was exerting influence over the area, a Latin script was designed for the language, and was used for some time, and this is the Latin script that's sometimes used to write it still today, although it's not very common. However, eventually, the Soviet Union decided that they wanted to Russify all of their colonies effectively, and this is when they started introducing the Cyrillic script. We've seen them do this with so many other languages like the Turkic languages in Central Asia and so forth. We've talked about it in different videos. They start off using the Latin script and then at some point they decide to Cyrillicize them. This is also the only Cyrillic script that uses the letter ash. Also in South Ossetia, or at least in the Soviet Republic of Georgia, the Ossetian language was written in the Georgian script between 1938 to 1950, which is quite interesting, and we have texts such as this which are written in Ossetian but with the Georgian Medrachuli script. Finally, let's look at a sample of the language. Here we have it in the Cyrillic script, and then we have a romanization here, and if you really want, we have it in the Georgian script too. This is of course the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you speak an Iranian language, you can compare it. It's unlikely to be able to understand it. Surprisingly, it's fairly closely related to the Baloch language, despite being very far apart from it, because they're both Eastern Iranian, or so I've heard. Also, if you've ever played The Witcher 3, you might have heard this language before, as the character Gordro Dim speaks a line of it in the game, and that's when I first was exposed to this language and found out that it even existed. I think it's really cool that the video games were trying to put lesser known languages in it. Gordro Dim ends up speaking several lines of dialogue in some very strange languages, including a French Creole that's spoken somewhere in the West Indies as well. I won't ruin the scene in case it's a spoiler, but I'll leave a link to that video in the corner right now. But for now we're going to talk about our second language of the day. The language we're going to talk about next is actually sort of related to a video I did a couple of weeks ago. This language is Zaza, which is spoken by many ethnic Kurds despite not being a Kurdish language, and is also spoken by the Zazaki people who more or less view themselves as Kurdish. This is supposedly their flag, but I found this on a dodgy source, and as you can see it's quite low resolution, and I'm no Zaza expert, so I'm just going to use the Kurdish flag, given that many of them identify with that. And as you can see, it's spoken in Anatolia, and it's even got some enclaves, or rather exclaves, of speech communities in Western Anatolia as well. And again, they associate themselves with Kurds, and they want to be part of a future Kurdish state. The Zazaki people themselves and the Kurdish people, it's very hard to distinguish between them, and a Kurdish friend of mine even told me that those divisions were only made by the Turkish government to divide them. I don't know how much I believe that, given that they did have a bit of a separate evolution, but they are still linked ultimately. So the Zaza language is called Zazaki, Kirmanchki, which sounds a bit like Kurmanji, or Kurdki, which just means Kurdish. It has 3 to 4 million speakers, somewhere around there. And it's from the Zaza Gorani language, which is related to Kurdish via the Median language, which we talked about in my Kurdish video before. It was a language of antiquity, of the Median Empire, and it's split off into a couple of groups. And here's showing that Median split off into Zaza Gorani and Parthian. Gorani and Zazaki are related to it distantly. And here's that map again that I showed, but most of the time it's not uncommon to see a map of the Kurdish languages, which also just happen to include Zaza within them. So the first Zazaki text was written only in 1899. It's lived most of its life as an unwritten language. There was a poet, scholar, he was also a mufti, called Ahmed Khasi, and he wrote this book, which I'm not going to pronounce. Here is a picture of the first page of the book, and it was written in the Arabic script, as you can see. Not many more books were written. A few more were written by that same person, although apparently for political reasons his grandson ended up burning the books in 1979. I'm not going to go into that though. But in the 1980s it started to be written in the Latin script. So let's talk about the phonology. As you can see, this is similar to Kurmanji Kurdish. There's similarities here as well, such as the distinction between pharyngalization with the consonant T and S, another feature that it shares with Kurmanji. It's closer to Kurmanji than any other Kurdish dialects, but it's not mutually intelligible, as we'll get to see. There's 2 main dialects, northern and southern, and they have their own subdialects. And here is the Latin script. It's almost identical to the Kurmanji Kurdish script, with the difference that it has the letter Re. So let's look at an example of Zaza. Here's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as you probably guessed. And if you do want to compare it with the Kurmanji text from the other video, you can see that there are some very clear cognates such as Azad and Mafan, and you can see the cognate between Bilivin and Biluweni at the end, but at the end of the day it's pretty safe to say that they're not mutually intelligible. Yeah, as I said, the politics gets a bit messy, and most Zazakis and Gorani people today identify themselves as Kurdish, and they're just another extension of the Kurdish people. Let me know what you think, and we're going to move on to our final language of today. The final language today that we're going to talk about I only found out recently, and it's thanks to a viewer called Ali. He also helped us with Forgotten Romance Languages Part 5 with Gere and Guernsey. But he told me about this language I didn't actually know existed, or I'd heard a bit about it before. I didn't realise what it was and how interesting it is. And the language is called Kumzari. It's spoken in Oman, but despite this, it's a Persian language, an Iranian language rather. As you can see, it's spoken here in the Strait of Hormuz, in the very northern tip of Oman. There's also another dialect of the same language, which is arguably a separate language spoken on the Larak island, called the Laraki dialect. And that's an island owned by Iran. It's just at the very top of that map, just there. But here we're talking about a language on mainland Oman. So Kumzari is called just exactly that in the language, and it has only 6,030 speakers as of a 2020 survey. It's a southwestern Iranian language and it's descended from Luri. Now originally this section was on Luri, but after finding out about Kumzari, I just deleted the entire section and remade it about Kumzari because I found it way more interesting. It's spoken in the town of Kumzar, which is the one in the background photo in the very north of Oman, and as you may know, that part of Oman is an exclave. The capital of that exclave is a city called Khassab, and there's a quarter of that city called Harat al-Kumzar, which is also a place where the Kumzari language is spoken. And then finally there's the island of Larak, as we already mentioned, although Larak arguably could be a different language according to some scholars. It's just not very well studied at all. Here's the phonology of the language, which is rather interesting because it features a distinction between all these, which shows the Arabic influence on the language. You could also make the same argument for the pharyngeals just here. And then here's the vowels. We once again see this rather rare phoneme, which I'd never seen before I made this video, so that's 2 Iranian languages that have that sound, which I found quite interesting. And finally, as you'd expect, it's written in the Arabic script, being situated in Oman. And something interesting I found out, apparently this language is not a new community. It's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, because if you didn't know, at one point Oman had a bit of a seafaring empire, and these people came over as a result of that from southern Iran. They're today mainly fishermen, but yeah, they've been there for hundreds of years. Here's a text in Kumzari, but to many people that won't mean anything, so luckily I have a romanization, and here's the actual translation of that text. It's some local story somewhere in Kumzar, apparently. I got it off Omniglot, but you can see what it's like, and there's definitely some interesting Arabic influence in here. Most of the speakers are bilingual Arabic, and Kumzari speakers is important to mention. But anyway, I hope you found this one a very interesting language, like I did. It's really cool that it just exists for a start. But for now, we're going to wrap up this video for today. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I know I've been planning it for a very long time and kept on saying that I'd make a video on forgotten Indo-Iranian languages. In fact, ever since I made my Languages of Persia video, I promised that I would make this video. So I hope it was up to expectation, and next time I would hope to talk about more of the Indo-Aryan languages in India, because there's some really interesting ones there as well. Thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing and tell me everything interesting you want to tell me in the comments. We'll have a discussion about these languages. But for now, I will see you next week. Yalla.